Hey there everyone, Afrodo Reviews here, bringing you another book to determine, is it worth reading of a second breakfast? Or does it deserve the fiery pits of Mount Doom? So let's decide. And you know what? It's time for us to celebrate the fall equinox with an Autumn Twilight. Seriously, you guys have no idea how much I pushed to get this one video out exactly on the fall equinox, so... Dragons of the Autumn Twilight is a Dragonlance book written by Margaret Weis, I think it's Weis, and Tracy Hickman, and was published on November 1984. I couldn't find an exact date through my research. I just found November. I couldn't get anything more specific than that, so I apologize. The novel itself, from what I could actually find, is the first Dragonlance novel within the book, and is the first in the Chronicles trilogy. It also corresponds directly with the first two Dragonlance modules, Dragons of Despair and Dragons of Flame. The ratings I could find on this book were rather decent. Apart from that, this book has actually received a couple of adaptations. The first was a comic book adaptation in 2006, written by Devil's Due Publishing Company. The second one was a movie adaptation released in 2008. It was not good.
What are you slime doing in Solace?
Slime? At least I'm not a half-breed.
Now, moving on to the actual review itself, we go on to the part of the review that we always start with. The cover. Now, the cover, I actually kind of like on this book. It's kind of small. I hope I'm getting this in frame right, and you guys can see it. But basically, it has three of our main characters sitting here in front, kind of posing in the front of a town in a sort of clearing where there's autumn trees all around them. Now, these, like I said, these are three main characters. This is Flint Fireforge, who is the dwarf character. This is Tanis Half-Elven. Yes, that is his last name. And this is the barbarian character named Goldmoon. Behind them is Flint and Tanis' hometown, well, actually most of the companions' hometown, of Solace. And while it is nice and interesting to see that, if I had one complaint about this cover, it's that Solace isn't really that big of a setting within the novel itself. So it doesn't feel like that should be the background. But that is a minor complaint. On the back of the book, it's pretty simple. It's just a continuation of the front, so you can open it and see one long, unending picture. Well, one longer picture. Portrait, I think is what I'm looking for. Along with the synopsis. Now, normally I would tell you go check out the TBR if you hadn't read the synopsis. If you didn't want to know the synopsis. However, this was for my minor TBR. I'm mostly talking about it because I didn't finish The Feral Detective, so I hadn't actually set in stone the fact that I would talk about this book this month. So, I just want to put that out there. I'm not going to read it. It's going to waste a little bit of time, and I'm just going to go into the synopsis next anyways, so... let's get to that, the synopsis. Now, the story of the book. This book takes place in the Dragonlance setting, which for those of you like me who've never experienced Dragonlance on the table, exists within the realm of Cream. The novel takes place during a time where the True Gods, a pantheon of gods unique to the Dragonlance setting, are believed to have abandoned the world, and the world itself is just starting to recover from the event, one known as the Cataclysm, which caused massive untold damage. However, during this time, a group known as the Seekers goes around and seems to be attempting to replace the true gods with their own made-up gods. Maybe one day, if I ever really felt like it, I'd do a full history breakdown on the Dragonlance setting, but for now, that's all you really need to know to understand what's taking place during this time period. Now, the story of itself about this book is the tale of a group of adventuring friends coming back together after 5 years of separation, after they went off to go do their own things, in their hometown of Solus. These friends include Flint Fireforge, a dwarven fighter, Tanis Half-Elven, who is a half-elf archer, kind of a stereotypical I fight with both sides of myself, Tasselhoff Burford, a Kinder rogue, which Kinders are sort of like discount halflings. Looking it up, I actually found the Kinder race was created to be a discount halfling, effectively, because when they created the Dragonlance setting and wanted to write this book, they wanted to avoid any unnecessary comparisons to another book of a certain kind which involves halflings and dragons. Can't quite put my finger on it, though. What are you doing here? Also, I got one of the older versions of Hobbit, but like, look at that. Look at what Smeagol used to look like. Isn't that weird? So weird, isn't it? Okay, we just left off Tasselhoff Burford, the Kinder, who has a habit of just kind of grabbing things without realizing he was stealing them. You have Caramon and Raceland, who are polar opposite twins. Caramon is a thick-armed, thick-headed barbarian, effectively, in terms of class, whereas Raceland is a frail yet very intelligent wizard. Finally, you have Sturm Brightblade, a knight of a sort of disgraced order of knights who's trying to reclaim his family honor and prove his knight order's proper honor and stuff, I guess is a good way of putting it. There is a 7th character that was supposed to meet them here, but she never actually appears, so I'm not going to bring her up. I'll get more into this later, but for now, that's basically it. So anyways, these companions basically reconvene in their hometown. After spending a few years adventuring with each other, they had all separated for their own ways for about 5 years, before coming back together and kind of just meeting up and hanging out. However, while they're in town, these companions run across the high theocrat of their area, a man who runs the Seekers, at least in that area, who is employing hobgoblins while looking for a specific magic staff of some reason. Of some power for a reason that is unknown to them. While they encounter the goblins, they actually encounter the person wielding the staff later on, the barbarian woman named Goldmoon and her not-quite husband Riverwind. And they accidentally get involved with him while defending them from the High Theocrat and his goblin horde, forcing them to go along on this adventure, which leads to maybe the return of the true gods to the Dragonlance setting. And the Dragon Menace, which at this point were thought to be nothing more than myths. Now, for the most part, I actually enjoyed this story. A lot. By and far, my favorite character this entire book was Flint Fireforge. Now, this was mostly because Flint, I felt, had the best character. Tasselhoff was a close second, and while I did like Tanis for his stabilizing element, he wasn't as interesting, but he is close to third. Now, Flint is honestly my favorite, because he is just so chock full of a good characterization that I enjoyed reading his scenes. For example, he comes off like he dislikes everyone in the group. He's basically a grumpy old man. But several times you see throughout the book is he just kind of puts on that front. When he's picked up and hugged by his friends, he returns the hug for like 1 or 2 seconds before realizing what he's doing and starts complaining. He claims he hates Tasselhoff and like is constantly seems to be putting him down. But when the moment Tasselhoff is in any kind of danger, Flint is one of the first people to dive into the fires to try to save him, even if it seems like Tasselhoff would already be dead. His biggest worry throughout the book isn't anything like I need to reclaim my family's honor or anything like that. It's the belief that he's getting so old that he's going to be nothing but a burden to his friends, and they'll be better off just leaving him behind. You really get the sense that, though he portrays it as differently, Flint truly cares for his friends as if they were his family. And I really love that characterization. Especially with one of the complaints I have later. It's more of a nitpick. But all the other characters at times feel like they can barely stand each other. The only other person who feels like he just genuinely likes everyone else in the group is Tasselhoff, who is more of a cuckoo lander than a straight character like Flint. Another thing I genuinely enjoyed about this book was that when it tried, it really did hit those sad scenes hard. And it does use a few cliches and manipulative moments to do so. But both times I read those super sad scenes, or at least one time that was supposed to be sad, and another time that wasn't, that I think you were supposed to be sad, but not as much. My eyes teared up. I almost actually cried on the second one, but I'm unsure on how much I was actually supposed to feel sad in that point. I still felt it, so I'm counting it. But yeah, this book is really good at making you feel emotions when you want to feel them. However, with the good also comes the bad. This book has a few bad things I need to discuss here. The first is that while I can enjoy this book having never played in the Dragonlance setting, it's very clear this was not written for anyone but fans of the setting. Not fans of the Dragonlance setting, and especially not for people who aren't, at least in some way, connected to D&D, even if they have some basic knowledge of the supplemental lore. In the background section of this video, you remember how I said this was the first novel of the Dragonlance setting, at least from what I could find? That's actually a bad thing, because when I picked up this book and was reading through it, it read like I was in like a second or third adventure with this group of characters. It didn't feel like this was the first adventure meeting them. It felt like I was dropped into the middle of a D&D group with a party that's been together for 5 years. They had all these references and relationships and backgrounds that they reference all the time, but as the new person at the table, I felt left out because I mostly don't know what they're talking about. Like, one example is Flint is terrified of water. Now, this is because, as from what I could piece together from the references, Caramon accidentally pushed him out of a boat one time and Flint almost drowned. And ever since then, Flint has been terrified of water and boats in general. Another issue is the relationship between Tanis and the seventh member of the group who doesn't show up, which is Caramon's and Raceland's half-sister. Now, we're led to believe that Tanis and this half-sister, I'm trying to remember her name. Like I said, she's mentioned, but she doesn't ever show up in the book, so it's hard to remember her. But Tanis and this half-sister got to the point where they were practically in a relationship, just hadn't admitted it to each other. And so you see Tanis agonize over the fact that he isn't able to tell this woman that he wants to be with her. And there's even that conflict where he meets someone else from his past who he was once in a relationship with and still very much wants to be in a relationship with him. Except it's hard to take that agony within him of the... Ironically, the relationships also feature the not so subtle tear between his human half and his elf half, because one is an elf childhood friend he grew up with, and the other is a human. Like I said, it's kind of cliche. But it's hard to feel for one side of that when I don't even know that side, other than Tana saying, we grew really close. I kind of want to be her boyfriend. You know what I mean? And this also comes back in the form of the group dynamics I talked about. It feels like these people hate each other at times. And because we don't know their history with each other, it's hard to determine if that hatred is small spats we're seeing that's going to iron themselves out, or genuine dislike of each other, and they're only forced to work together because of the situation at hand. Sturm and Caramon, for example, clearly don't like each other at all in this book. Raceland, I wonder why anyone trusts other than his brother, who has a familial loyalty to him. Then you have Tasselhoff, who everyone just kind of brushes off his eccentricities, like as a kinder, because like I said, he kind of steals things without realizing he's stealing them. He just thinks, ooh, shiny, oh, that's kind of cool too. He doesn't realize he's doing that. So in a way, it becomes really hard to take these moments where they're at each other's throats and like about to come to blows, as just tense moments of friends fighting, more as just this group of people who can't stand each other but are forced to work together. Another particular complaint I had was that this one's going to be a bit tougher to talk about. Now, I've made it no secret that in the past, I don't necessarily think that every fantasy race needs to be analogous to a real-world culture or identity. And that when we call racism on those races for having certain characteristics, because they sort of line up to bad stereotypes for this culture, I think it's a little jumping the gun. Yes, there is merit to some of the arguments for some of these races. Some are clearly just analogies for a real-world race. But I think by and large, a fantasy race can just exist on its own and have these little bad stereotypes that happen to fit with there without needing to be connected to that. That being said, this book gets uncomfortable at certain points. While there's no real analogous connection that I made, there is a certain point in the book where I felt really uncomfortable with the fantasy racism. There's a species in here known as the Goalie Dwarves, which are sort of like, for those of you who know D&D, the Duergar, but taking away every bit of intelligence they have and craftsmanship and kind of mixing them with kobolds and Koatoa. It's just one of those, the narrative itself and the characters are good heroes. See these goalie dwarves and describe them in such horrible ways, like how ugly they are, how stupid they are. The narrative just seems to go out of the way to constantly remind us about how pitiful and cowardly and stupid and everything about goalie dwarves is.
Only one thing I hate more than a gully dwarf, and that's a goblet.
And we have our heroes barely blinking an eye at times when and barely considering lives of goalie dwarves in their plans. There was at one point, now I may have read this scene wrong as I continued on, but there was at one point where it seems like Raistlin, who had charmed a group of goalie dwarves, seems to order them all to commit suicide effectively to give the heroes an edge in a fight that they were having. Basically, there was a really cool fight scene. This fight scene was awesome, by the way, before this point, where there's basically a ladder system where there's two lard buckets. They put a whole bunch of weight in one and bring up the other one, then put a whole bunch of weight in that and bring that up too. The heroes are basically fighting in this bucket, but because of their weight, they're starting to bring up a whole bunch of reinforcements to the other bucket to the rest of the team up here. So Raistlin, not wanting them to get up there and swarm them, orders a whole bunch of the goalie dwarves he charmed to leap into this bucket, and the last thing we see of it is it plummeting down into the mists. Now, the group is mentioned a group of charmed goalie dwarves is mentioned later as surrounding him, so maybe they survived, and maybe I misread that, but at that point, like, no one seemed concerned with the fact that even if they did survive, they basically just got the Draconians to kill a whole bunch of goalie dwarves in anger. The Draconians being their enemies right now. It does get a little better near the end. Tasselhoff actually befriends a goalie dwarf later on and seems to genuinely care about him as a person. But by then, it's a little too late because it's just so far away from this scene. And there's also Boopoo. Boopoo. Yeah, that's actually her name. I'm going to put that down there because I'm pretty sure it's Boopoo.
Meet our new ally.
Papu, good to meet.
Who is a goalie dwarf female who it feels very uncomfortable watching as she's magically charmed by Raistlin. And the heroes basically take advantage of this magical charming to get her to take them to their leader, or to take them into secret passages.
Acular Calipad. It's safe. You can come out now.
What did you do to her?
A spell of friendship.
It looks like you overdid it a little.
And otherwise, what seemed to be harmless, if somewhat dumb, people. They really don't seem like these malevolent creatures. And it's kind of funny, because when this starts, Flint is the first person to say he hates goalie dwarfs. He wants nothing to do with them. He despises them in every conceivable fashion. And you think he's going to be our bigot dwarf. You know, the dwarves who hate everything that's not their specific subrace of dwarf. Except no, he's actually the only person with a legitimate reason to dislike goalie dwarves, because it's revealed later that he was basically enslaved by them for 3 years. Whereas everyone else's hatred and dislike of the goalie dwarves exists simply because they're goalie dwarves. You know what I mean? I may cut this out, I'm not sure, but that's basically what I have to say about that. Apart from that, everything else I can talk about on this book is more minor nitpicks. You know, simple things like there being a subplot about a traitor in their midst who's feeding the enemy information, but that it being really easy to figure out who exactly the traitor is despite all the attempts at building up the mystique or the enigma behind the traitor's identity. Because the narrative pushes so hard for you to think it's this one guy you know, it cannot be him, because it wouldn't be surprising if it was. There's another small nitpick where when the bad guys finally do start their campaign against the world of good, effectively, it just doesn't feel... It feels like it happens too fast. The first part of the story, from when they're trying to prevent the bad guys from rising up and when they return to find the bad guys had risen up, takes place over the week, according to them. And in that week, somehow they managed to bring all the kingdoms of good down to their knees to the point where they're either fleeing, they're on their last legs of a battle, or they've already been conquered. And it just doesn't make sense to me. It's way too fast. There's also the dragons themselves in this book, for being these big, menacing threats that are built up to from the very beginning. Almost all of them are defeated in a somewhat disappointing way. The first one was super disappointing. The second and third one was kind of cool, but the method in which they ended up being defeated was kind of pulled out of nowhere at the last minute, in my opinion. That's one of those, you should have built it up for a bit before you use this. Not that it was bad, it's just there was no build up. So yeah, basically a whole bunch of minor things which I felt affected the book, but not enough to super affect the book. Maybe like a 0.1 removal of points. But all in all, I think the story is pretty decent. And compared to the other things I read this month, it's actually a pretty good book. So, I'd give it a 7 out of 10. Now, to be fair, for a while it teetered between 6 and 7. And then near the end it teetered between 7 and 8. However, I took a look at it and realized since 7 was the common denominator in that, it had to have been a 7. And I'll say basically, the first part is definitely a 6, closer to a 6, but the second part is definitely closer to an 8. So if you can suffer through it, it's that. If you're looking for book recommendations, it's a good fantasy book, but I definitely don't recommend picking it up if you don't know the Dragonlance setting, or at the very least, D&D supplemental stuff, like the lore of like how dragons work, how magic works, and all that. Because this book is really not interested in explaining itself all that much. It assumes that you're already familiar with everything, and from there it just kind of goes on. Otherwise, it's a pretty good fantasy novel to read. Now, that being said, since this is the end of the month, and technically I am filming this review after the Da Vinci Code review, I can't really do anything to hint at what's going to be next. So, yeah. Remember, with every book comes an adventure. And every adventure is worth having. Even the bad one. I suppose I should probably do this like, comment, and subscribe thing at the back again, but... nah, I think I'm not going to do it anymore. Bye!